My brother always had this strange talent for pretending his life was perfect, while quietly letting everyone else around him shoulder the consequences of his choices. And for most of my life, I let myself believe that it wasn't my place to question it, because that's what our mother taught me. He's the older one, sweetheart. You don't understand his pressures. As if being born 3 years earlier somehow turned him into a delicate prince who needed the entire family to bend around his irresponsibility. And maybe that's why at 4:30 in the morning on the coldest night of December, when I heard desperate pounding on my front door, I didn't immediately expect to see his 2 little kids, 5 and 7 years old, standing on my porch in nothing but thin pajamas, their hair messy, their faces blotchy from crying, their little hands red and trembling from the cold. And the sight hit me so violently that for a second I forgot how to breathe, because no matter what mistakes adults make, children should never have to carry the consequences, never be left out in the icy dark begging for help from the one person their parents constantly belittled. I yanked open the door and the cold wind cut across my face like a warning, but the little ones rushed forward and wrapped their freezing arms around my legs before I could even speak, and I felt their tiny bodies shaking, not just from the cold but from fear, real fear, the kind children shouldn't know. And I pulled them inside immediately, locking the door, grabbing blankets, kneeling down to hold them against me as I asked, as gently as I could, "Where are your mom and dad?" But the 2 of them wouldn't answer. They just looked at each other with these terrified glances like they'd seen something horrible or had been told not to speak. It took nearly 10 minutes, warm cocoa, and the soft promise that they weren't in trouble for them to finally open up. And even then, the 7-year-old, Emily, spoke in that cautious small voice kids use when they think their honesty might get them punished. And she said they had been in the car with their mom when she and my brother started screaming at each other again, shouting about money and babysitting and "that useless sister of yours." And then the argument apparently turned into something else, some twisted plan my brother had that involved dropping the kids off with me just for a night. But instead of knocking, their parents fought the whole way, forgot the kids were even in the back seat. And when they finally pulled up outside my house, they didn't even stay long enough to bring them to the door. They apparently told the kids to "go wake your aunt," and then drove off again because, as the younger one whispered with a cracking voice, "Daddy said he didn't have time for this." And the part that made my stomach twist wasn't the irresponsibility, that I'd come to expect. It was the realization that they hadn't even checked if I was awake, home, or even alive. They dumped 2 little children outside at 4:30 a.m. in winter cold that could have put them in the hospital. And if the kids hadn't knocked hard enough, if I had been asleep, if I hadn't heard, and the rage that simmered inside me wasn't loud, it wasn't fiery, it was cold, steady, a pulse of something that had been waiting years to rise. Because this wasn't the first time my brother assumed I'd fix his problems. He'd borrowed money, crashed on my couch, used my car, and then mocked me when I couldn't attend a family trip because of finances he himself helped ruin. But this was different. This was the line, the one you don't cross, not when it comes to innocent kids who didn't choose their parents. I didn't call him immediately. My priority was the children. But as the sunrise crept across the windows and the kids slept curled under thick blankets on my couch, I finally allowed myself to process the unbelievable reality. My brother and his wife drove away from their children, left them in freezing December air, and didn't bother to check whether the door was even opened. And in that moment, with the quiet house holding only the soft breathing of those 2 little souls, I realized something heavy and painful. No one in our family had ever protected me from being discarded, forgotten, or taken for granted. But I was not going to repeat that cycle with his kids. I made a silent promise right then, one that would grow into something much bigger, that whatever storm was coming next, I was finished being the person my brother tossed responsibility onto and walked away. I was going to protect these kids, even if it meant confronting the family dynamic that had allowed my brother to become someone capable of abandoning his own children in the dark. When I opened the door and saw my brother's kids, barefoot, shivering, pajamas soaked from standing in the icy pre-dawn dew, I felt something inside me crack in a way I hadn't felt since the night our parents left me waiting outside the school gym because they forgot the time, and that old wound pulsed as the kids clung to me with frozen fingers, whispering that Mommy and Daddy went to a party and they locked the door and we didn't know where else to go. And in that moment, every memory of how my brother used to bully me, how he used to take my things, how he used to mock me in front of cousins while our parents laughed and said, "He's just being a boy," suddenly collided with the sight of his own children trembling and terrified at my doorstep. I gathered them inside, wrapped them in blankets, made hot cocoa, turned on the heater, and tried to coax out the truth. And the story spilled from them in broken little pieces. How their parents told them they didn't need a babysitter because your uncle lives close. How my brother had bragged at dinner the week before that I owed him for all the times he had covered for me growing up. How he assumed I would watch the kids because he's doing better now, so it's his turn to help. And suddenly the whole night made sense. They thought they could dump responsibility on me without asking, without respect, without even informing me. Just assuming I was still the same quiet, overlooked sibling who accepted scraps of affection and pretended it was enough. But this time, I wasn't that person. And as the kids slept on my couch, small bodies finally warm, I stared at the ceiling and realized a truth so loud, it almost scared me. My brother and his wife didn't just neglect their children tonight, they weaponized me as a backup plan. The way my family had always done, treating me as the emotional, logistical, and moral safety net they never bothered to maintain. Morning came gray and cold, and I knew they'd eventually show up not worried, but angry, and I wasn't wrong. At 9:12 a.m., the banging started, furious and entitled, my brother's voice shouting, "Open the damn door! You can't just take my kids!" before I even touched the lock. And when I did open it, only the screen door between us, he pushed against it like he owned the place, his wife behind him with crossed arms and smeared mascara, ready to accuse, ready to twist the narrative to make themselves victims. But I stayed calm as I said, they were freezing outside my house at 4 in the morning, and the way their faces flickered, just for a second, told me they knew exactly what they'd done. His wife started her performance first, hand on chest, voice wobbling. "We left them to sleep. They must have wandered out. They do that sometimes." But the older child, hearing her, came up behind me and whispered, "That's not true." And suddenly, the whole truth poured from him in front of his stunned parents. How they'd gotten dressed up, how they said, "Be quiet and don't wake the neighbors," how their father said, "Your uncle will deal with you if something happens," and how they locked the door from the outside. My brother's face drained like someone had ripped open a secret he planned to bury, and he snapped at his son, "Stop lying!" But he flinched, and that reaction alone was enough for me to step between them, saying, "You're not taking them until we clear this up." And that sentence ignited something primal in my brother. He lunged forward, jabbing a finger at my chest, spitting that I was trying to steal his kids, that I wanted to revenge for childhood crap nobody remembers, that I had always been dramatic. And with every word I realized, he was terrified. Not of losing the kids, but of losing control over the version of himself he curated for everyone else. His wife chimed in, shrill and brittle. "We didn't do anything wrong. We're just tired. We needed a break." And my mind flashed back to every Christmas they forgot my gift, every dinner they excluded me from, every childhood moment I spent alone while my parents poured affection and attention into my brother as if raising him was the only job they had. I called the police, not to punish them, but to document what happened, to protect the kids. And when the officers arrived, my brother transformed into a trembling, over-polite version of himself, shaking hands, pretending concern, acting shocked that the children were left outside. But the kids repeated their story clearly, consistently, bravely. And when the officer turned to me and said quietly, "You did the right thing," I felt something in my chest loosen. Social services were contacted, not to remove the kids immediately, but to follow up, to interview, to investigate patterns. And my brother's mask cracked visibly as he realized this wasn't something he could shout out of existence. After the police left, he slumped on my porch, not humbled, but calculating, and hissed, "You'll pay for this," the same tone he used when we were children, and he'd break my things, then cry loud enough to make the adults scold me for upsetting him. His wife muttered that I ruined their lives, ignoring the fact that they nearly ruined their children's safety. When they finally drove away, the house fell silent except for the soft breathing of the kids still wrapped in blankets on my couch, and as I looked at their small faces, peaceful finally, I knew that nothing in our family would ever be the same again, and that maybe, for the first time in my life, that was a good thing. Over the next week, the investigation progressed. Teachers sent notes confirming the children often arrived tired, hungry, or wearing the wrong clothes for the weather. Neighbors told stories of hearing shouting late at night, and everything my brother tried to bury surfaced like a long, rotting truth forced into daylight. My parents called me in a panic, not to ask how I was, not to ask how the children were, but to scold me for making things public and embarrassing the family. And I realized then that the pattern had always been the same: appearance over reality, favoritism over fairness, silence over accountability. But this time I didn't bend, didn't apologize, didn't soften myself to fit the role of the forgotten sibling, the spare part, the background character. Because the stakes were no longer just my emotions, but those two small children whose parents had failed them so deeply. When the social worker asked if I could watch the kids for a while during evaluations, the answer came easily, not from spite, not from revenge, but from a place of quiet strength I hadn't recognized in myself before. And as the kids settled into my home, drawing pictures at my kitchen table, laughing at shows, asking curious questions, a strange warmth bloomed in my chest. Maybe this was the first time in years that something good, something genuinely good, had come from the wreckage my family left behind. But I also knew this wasn't the end, because my brother and his wife were going to fight back, going to twist, going to claw at anything they could salvage. And the storm I sensed on the horizon wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of the storm. When the hearing date finally arrived, a gray morning with low clouds pressing against the courthouse windows, I walked in holding the small hands of my niece and nephew, their palms warm and steady in mine, while my brother and his wife stood across the hallway looking like people who had spent weeks rehearsing a performance they believed would win over everyone. My brother in a too-tight suit, jaw clenched, eyes darting between the kids and me as if trying to decide whether to glare or plead. His wife with her hair scraped back, face pale, tongue already moistening her lips the way it did when she was preparing to cry on command. And as soon as they saw me, they approached with the same twisted confidence they used their entire lives, the kind that comes from never being held accountable. My brother leaning in close enough that I could smell the mint gum he chewed to mask a night of anxiety, whispering, "You're not their parent. You're nothing. They're coming home with us today." And something in me stilled, not with fear, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had already broken free from the invisible chains that once kept me small. The kids tightened their hold on me, their bodies instinctively shifting behind me as if I were a shield. And seeing their fear rise just from the presence of their own parents, sent a sharp, cold clarity through me, a reminder that this wasn't about revenge anymore, not even about my childhood wounds, but about two small lives depending on an adult who wouldn't fail them the way everyone else had. Inside the hearing room, the judge, a woman with silver hair pulled into a bun and eyes sharp enough to slice through pretense, listened patiently as the social worker presented weeks of observations, patterns of neglect, inconsistent meals, long nights alone, unexplained bruises the children had mentioned quietly, and repeated descriptions of being called burdens or accidents by their parents. And with each piece of evidence, I watched my brother shrink, his shoulders curling inward as if the truth were a weight someone had finally forced him to carry. His wife tried to interrupt, voice trembling dramatically, claiming the kids misunderstood, claiming they wandered the night they came to my house, claiming they never locked the door. But the judge raised one hand, silencing her with the tired firmness of someone who had heard 1,000 excuses shaped exactly like this one. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice, didn't attack, didn't make it about childhood or old wounds, because those things didn't matter now. I simply described what I saw that night. The shivering bodies, the soaked pajamas, the fear in their eyes, the way they clung to me like I was the last safe person in a cold world. And the room felt painfully still as my niece gently reached for my sleeve and whispered, "Can we stay with you?" in a voice so soft it carried more impact than any argument ever could. My brother exploded then, leaping to his feet, shouting that I manipulated the kids, that I had always been a problem, that I wanted to destroy his family because I didn't have one. His words cracking through the room like a desperate man trying to punch holes in the truth, but all it did was reveal exactly the temperament that had been poisoning his children long before that night. The judge called for order, her voice slicing through his rage like a blade, and after a tense silence, she read her decision. Temporary custody granted to me, pending further evaluation. Mandatory parenting classes for my brother and his wife, ongoing supervision by social services, and strict visitation rules requiring them to show basic stability before so much as a weekend visit could be considered. My brother's face collapsed in on itself, fury and disbelief twisting him into a version of himself I recognized from childhood, the boy who couldn't stand losing, who would break my toys and blame me when caught, who would whisper threats that adults never believed. But now his tantrum wasn't aimed at me, it was aimed at the consequences life had finally handed him. His wife began sobbing loudly, a theatrical wail that echoed down the hallway as they followed the bailiff out. But something about her tears felt hollow, performative, and the judge's exhausted sigh told me she felt the same. The drive home that day was quiet, not heavy, not tense, just quiet in the way freshly cleaned rooms are quiet. My niece staring out the window, my nephew clutching the stuffed dinosaur I'd bought him the week before, and when we pulled into my driveway, they exhaled in sync, like arriving home was a relief they didn't want to admit out loud. Over the next weeks, a routine formed. Breakfast together, school drops, bedtime stories that slowly replaced nightmares, laughter that filled spaces of my home I didn't realize had been hollow. And each day I found myself undoing knots inside me I hadn't acknowledged since childhood. A night they showed up barefoot and shivering wasn't just the beginning of their escape. It was the beginning of mine.